With the UCAT window now in full swing, you're probably about ready to take your exam. So with that, I'm going to give you the 9 most impactful tips that are going to help you score highly in the abstract reasoning. Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name's Dr. Ashley Hilton, and today we're going to be talking about the 9 most important things that you need to bear in mind when doing the abstract reasoning of the UCAT to ensure that you get your highest possible mark. We're going to be talking about the key things you need to know, the most effective techniques, the common traps that they try and catch you with, and then finally the tricks to try and avoid them. So let's just dive straight in. So tip number 1 is that it's really important to know your definitions. So let's go through some of the key ones. Firstly, what does abstract mean? The Apple Dictionary definition of abstract is relating to or denoting art that does not attempt to represent external reality, but rather seeks to achieve its effect using shapes, colors, and textures. And that's exactly what the abstract reasoning is. It's giving you shapes, objects, letters even, that don't really mean anything, but are trying to get you to infer a pattern from them. So we'll come on to this with tricks later, but sometimes they will throw letters in there. And actually, that's because we associate meaning with them. But the reality is that we should treat them as shapes as if they're any other object. The second definition to know is when to select something as set A or set B. If something is to fit into set A or set B, it means that that particular test shape fits into every single box in that grid, not 5 out of the 6, but all 6 of the boxes. So that means that if we're going to select neither, which is either equally or if not more common than the other two, that means that it's either going to fit in none of the boxes, some of the boxes of each, or both sets of boxes. Because if it fits in both, it then can't fit exclusively to either one, so that makes it neither. The second high impact tip I have for you is start with the simplest box. A lot of people want to start with the top left box of set A, but that won't usually give you the quickest and best chance of working out the pattern quickly. So what is true for that bare bones box in that particular set is going to be true for all other boxes within that set. And of course, if you take the most simple box in that given set, then that's going to give you the best chance to work out what is going on and then implement that pattern and work it out for the entire set. Number 3 is to pick a strategy and follow it. Here's the 4-step plan that I particularly recommend. So step 1 is contrary to the verbal reasoning, you ignore the test shape and go straight to the grids. You then find the bare bones box and start there. Once you've done that, you try and identify the pattern. Later, we're going to talk about the best ways to identify patterns. But once you've done that, then and only then do you look at the test shape and then work out whether it fits into A, B, or neither of the grids. So alongside having a robust process for how you're going to tackle these questions, you also need a really good method of identifying the pattern. So here's the one that I use and recommend that you at least give a try for identifying the patterns. And of course, it's a silly set of words, but the more ridiculous and stupid things are, usually the easier you tend to remember them in high pressure situations like exams. So I want you to imagine Gerard Butler from 300 on the battlefield, except for he's struggling with his tummy because he has IBS, hence Spartan IBS. So that stands for shape type, so whether it's circles, squares, etc. Position, where within the box are these certain shapes lying. Angles, and this is mainly right angles, one example of which we'll come to look at later. The only other time that I've seen that it's not right angles is if you are looking at clock faces and it's the type of acute or obtuse angles that they're representing with the arms on the clock. Route and direction, so for example, do you have triangles that are always pointing up or arrows that are always pointing to the left, for example? Are the objects touching the sides? This is typically seen with arrows. Area and size, so for example, are some overlapping shapes causing areas that are made by the intersection, and usually it's the number of areas that are made by those. Number of items, by far probably the most common pattern amongst these, usually in combination with others. Intersections, crossing points where shapes overlap. Borders, also known as the number of sides. And finally, shading. Is the shape coloured in some patterns versus in the other set it's not coloured in? Another one that sometimes comes up is conditional patterns, which we go into in depth in my online course. Another thing that we talk about on the course is how to, once we get used to certain types of questions, do the advanced method, which is the quick way of actually identifying these patterns given the type of question that shows up. So for those of you who have the course already, check out the last lesson where there is a cheat sheet for every type of question that come up and the quickest possible way to use these methods to speed up, identify the pattern in the fastest possible time. Points 5 and 6 are going to be looking at the less common types of questions that come up in the abstract reasoning, which are type 2 and type 3 questions. Type 2 questions are when you have a what's next in the series. So you'll typically have 3 shapes that are sequential and changing as they go along, and then you get 4 shapes to choose from for which of those completes the set. So here you just again need to use the Spartans IBS or the advanced method to identify what's changing each time, and that's going to help you predict exactly what should be coming up before you've even looked at the possible shapes to be tested. And again, we have an advanced method for this, but typically it's going to be either position, number, or shading that are the most common patterns for these types of questions. Type 3 questions are also very unique. They will give you a statement how one shape will relate to another. It will then ask you to work out what the relationship from one box to the next is, and then give you another test shape and identify the box that relates to that given the rules that you've worked out from the first example. So with the example on screen, it will say shape 1 is to shape 2 as to what shape 3 is to question mark. And then you have to choose from the 4 shapes A, B, C, or D as to which one fits those rules that you've worked out from the first example of statements. So again, the steps to tackle these types of questions very simply are: firstly, use Spartans IBS. Secondly, is to work out what's changing. Thirdly, then we eliminate the options one by one, ruling out which ones it cannot be from the rules that we've inferred. And then finally, we select the correct box that completes the statement. So point 7, which is actually the real tip for these two types of questions, is that the element changing for type 2 and type 3 questions is really only going to be one of a handful of things. So for type 2 and 3 questions, the element changing is usually going to be position, number, direction, shading, or size, and very rarely a combination of these. So number 8 is your favorite part of this, which is the traps that they try and lay to catch you out on these tricky abstract reasoning questions. We'll go through them in turn, and then number 9 is going to be how we avoid these common traps. The first thing they might try and do is trick you with letters. Now remember at the start we talked about what the definition of abstract is. They are shapes that have no meaning. So although you might be tricked into thinking that it's all vowels in one set versus all consonants in another, or it might all spell a city in one versus spell a country in the other, this is just a way to try and get you to attribute meaning to something that is abstract and by definition does not have meaning. So therefore letters are typically all about the number of right angles that they contain, and I'll show you a slide on screen now to illustrate exactly what that means in terms of number of angles created by different letters. The second trap that they're going to lay is time waster questions, which we're going to talk about how to tackle in the very next point. The third trick is that of combinations and or conditional patterns. Conditional patterns are, for example, when the circle is shaded, then the total number of sides is always odd, versus when the circle is not shaded, the total number of sides is always even. But often it's rarely as simple as that, and we have a whole module on the online course to identify how to tackle conditional patterns. But also to mention that they often try and combine some of the patterns that we talked about in the Spartan IBS. So be sure to be on the lookout for if something is very simple and it seems too simple, just double check to make sure that it is not combined with another of those patterns. The final trap that they can try and lay for you is distractions. So the pattern that's going on sometimes is very simple or quite straightforward, but they might throw also an overwhelming amount of shapes in the grids to try and put you off the pattern of what's going on. So that brings us on to our final point, which is the tricks that we're going to employ to avoid these traps. The first one to do is, if you're stuck with a pattern and can't identify it, what you can do sometimes is move around a little bit and look at the shapes from different angles. Sometimes when you take a zoom out and have a look and get the full perspective, the bird's eye view of the entire grid, you can kind of work out just from afar that maybe all the circles are in the bottom left corner, or look at those big global assessments that are going to help you work out the pattern. The second trick is not to feel like you have to start with the top left box of set A. As we said, if you start with the bare bones box from that grid, it's going to be the thing that is going to fit in all boxes of that grid. Therefore, whatever rules you infer has to apply to the rest of the grid, and trying to work it out by looking at the most basic one is going to give you the highest chance of getting the pattern, but also stop you getting distracted by those distractors that we talked about in the previous point. The next trick is to flag to avoid getting caught out by the time waster questions that we talked about previously. The UCAT exam writers purposely are going to throw in some questions that are so tricky that they're going to be very time consuming for you. They do that on purpose to make you waste time in the exam. So it's up to you to identify those questions that are there specifically to waste your time, flag them, make sure you get through the entire number of questions, and then come back to the time consuming ones after. If you saw my previous video here, which talks about the 10 most impactful tips for the verbal reasoning, you'll know that statistically, if you get through the exam and attempt everything, that's better than trying to get 100% accuracy and only completing 70%. So the golden rule here is if it's taking you more than 45 seconds to work out what's going on with a particular pattern, flag it, move on, and then come back only at the end if you have time after finishing all the other questions. The next tip is the good old trust your gut. Sometimes there are things going on that our eyes can see but our brains cannot explain. And there's a lot of science that sometimes that gut feeling when you're not sure otherwise what to do is going to be the likeliest to give you the right answer. The last but one trick is to really hone and practice the advanced or intuitive technique, as I call it on my course. These really vary depending on the type of question that come up, but if you learn something like that, it's going to help you go really, really quickly. It's a bit more than I have time to go into in a YouTube video, but if you wanted to check them out and learn how to go really fast, you can have a look at my online course where I go through every type of question and the advanced technique that's going to give you the highest accuracy and highest speed when tackling each type of question that comes up in the abstract reasoning. And the final trick is to remember that certain elements recur frequently in the abstract reasoning of the UCAT. So certain pattern types, certain question types, and certain ways that things are represented or relate to one another are very frequent and come up often. So the more that you practice, the more that you'll see these themes that recur frequently, and just make sure that you are able and have it down to tackle these particular ones so that you know majoritarily whatever comes up, you know there's going to be enough questions for you to be confident in that you're going to get some marks. So if you'd like more videos to teach you about how to nail the abstract reasoning, you can check out this new playlist that I've made just here where I have a handful of videos. Otherwise, I've done a very similar video to this with the 10 most impactful tips that you can do to nail the verbal reasoning, which you can see here. But otherwise, I will see you in one of those videos, and enjoy, and thanks for watching.